The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report, and we have a very important book with us today. Well, the author of the book, I shall say, and it's What Shall I Do With This People, just out from Simon & Schuster Free Press, really. It's been written by Milton Viorst, and he's an old-time hand at the Middle East. A very important book, and I'll tell you why. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated 7 years ago. I remember the funeral very, very clearly. The Knesset held a memorial for Milton, and very few people turned up 7 years ago.
Right.
And your book basically talks about Jews and the fractious politics of Judaism, and it's really pointed to the fact that the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin really changed the country. Is that correct or incorrect?
Well, it certainly was the turning point of the country. I think the country was in the process of changing, and the assassination of Rabin became the culmination of this change, and there has been no turning back to what was the recognition that the only way that Israel was going to make peace with its neighbors was to reach some political accommodation, a real political accommodation, not what Barak tried, because I think he was trying to convey the impression that it was a political accommodation, and it really, he wanted to keep the support of the settlers. Well, you can't do that. Rabin recognized that the settlers movement was an obstacle to peace, and he tried to deal with it. He wasn't successful, and in the end, he died trying.
What shall I do with this people is a biblical statement, isn't it?
It is. It's when
God is talking and lamenting.
No. Moses is talking. Moses is talking, and God is very unhappy with these grumbling Jews who had just come out of Egypt, who God had liberated, and they're complaining about your accommodations aren't good enough and that sort of thing. And Moses says, "What shall I do with this people? They are about to stone me." And God delivered. He nonetheless made the covenant with the Jews, notwithstanding this. Before Moses, as you remember, even got down from the mountain, the Jews were busy fashioning a golden calf. And God said, this stiff-necked people, they're driving me nuts.
Am Kshei Oref in Hebrew, it means a stiff-necked people.
Right.
And which means they're very stubborn. And the thesis of your book is that, I think you had an experience, I read a little bit of the book when you went to the religious quarters, Mea She'arim. You bought a talit for your son over there.
Right.
And years ago when you were brought up, you saw a man with a beard. You had great respect for him. He was rabbinical. He was the rabbi.
Right.
He was I also had that experience.
And he was our grandfather. He was my grandmother and grandfather.
He's a holy man, right?
Exactly.
And then what happened?
Well, I stumbled into the Asherim once on a Shabbat night by accident. It really was by accident. And they started to throw stones at me. And my car was attacked, and they were kicking at the door. And unfortunately, I was able to turn around and scoot out of there.
It was a Friday night or a Saturday night?
No, it was a Friday night. It was a Friday night. I didn't, I was wrong in that I was there, but it was an inadvertent effort. Somebody had to come over and say, "Sir, you're not supposed to be here on the Shabbat," and I would have gladly withdrawn. But it was that kind of edginess, that sense of playing violently with the law that I think, unfortunately, has come to characterize so much of Israeli society at this point. And particularly, I hate to say it, but on the religious side of the equation.
How so?
Well, you will remember, this is, in a way, you can say it's minor stuff to throw stones at me, and it was minor stuff. I didn't mind that. It was kind of funny. But the religious Zionists who occupied the occupied territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, did so originally against the law, And they proved to be so fervent, so zealous in their belief that no Israeli government has been able to get them out. I think that there has been an unfortunate willingness to hold that anything that religious Judaism can claim is God's commandment need not pay attention to civil law. There is the feeling that somehow if you can make the case that you are representing God's will, then you're allowed to do anything you want in that.
They had this problem last week.
Yeah, there was a, right.
They tried to, Fuad Ben Eliezer, the defense minister of Israel, tried to dismantle 10 caravans,
Right.
which was called the settlement, and he did it on a Sabbath day, on a Shabbat. And the soldiers were called up on Shabbat, and there was a tremendous, nearly a civil war. They called it a minor civil war in Israel. And this was the authority of the government facing these settlers or people. I guess there were a mix of all types of people there. You never know in these things. But it became a real troublesome area for a while.
Well, the Times has been full of troublesome stories this week. There was a quote that I cut out in which some settler was questioned by the reporter and said, listen, you know, I am doing this for God. I don't care what the law is. And that's, you can't run a state, whether it's a Jewish state or a democratic state or a lawful state, with that attitude. And that has been increasingly pervasive, and I think it's doing a great deal of damage to Israel, to the concept of a Jewish
Well, Milton, you've
democracy.
traveled throughout the Middle East. Isn't there a danger in the Arab fundamentalism also?
Of course there is, but yes, Arab fundamentalism is extremely strong. We know what that's all about. We've been getting deluged with that information since September 11th. I even wrote a book about it. It was called In the Shadow of the Prophet. But we didn't think so much of Jewish fundamentalism. It was the kind of idea that Jews could not conceive, that we should be fundamentalists and could be pushing the edges of the law in order to achieve objectives that we regard as somehow holy, even though the society as an entirety doesn't necessarily abide by that. But I think one of the things that we have to take into account is there are fundamentalists on both sides of this divide, and they are serving each other's purposes by standing in the way of any sort of rational accommodation between them.
March me a little bit through your background. I see you have praise for your book from Arthur Hertsberg, who's a very well-known rabbi, former conservative rabbi, but I schooled himself in an Orthodox yeshiva in Baltimore, and Balfour Brickner, who's the senior rabbi of the Stephen Weiss Synagogue. They praise your book very strongly here. Give me your background. How did you go to Hebrew school?
Yes, I went to Hebrew school, and I don't make any claims to being a great Talmudic scholar or anything remotely like that.
But you studied Jewish history in this
Yeah,
book.
but I'm a journalist and I'm a historian by training, and I decided that the only way I could understand what was going on in the Middle East, that we were missing something very important, to think that somehow religion was not a factor, and so I sat down and started out by reading the Torah from beginning to end, and went on from there with Jewish history and a whole other, well, a couple of years of study, and then felt that I understood what was going on well enough to write this book. It's a product of my background as a Jew, but also a lot of subsequent research that I did as a scholar and journalist.
Would you consider yourself a Zionist?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I am totally.
Asa Weitzman would say in order to be a Zionist, you have to live in Israel.
Well, Asa Weitzman isn't the only one who said that. But there are many ways to look at Zionism. And no, I have a family. I've got kids, and now I have grandchildren. And I don't particularly feel like abandoning them. I remain very dedicated to Israel. I've thought occasionally of moving there, but no, I'm an American. This is where my culture, this is where my society is, but that doesn't mean that I have any less esteem or love for Israel. But I am deeply troubled.
I'm sure you wrote this because you have love for Israel.
Yeah,
otherwise,
and I'm very troubled about what's going on there, because I see things are disintegrating, and I am not hopeful about what the outcome may very well turn out to be.
I see that you studied Rabbi Cook, the senior Rabbi Cook, and then the junior Rabbi Cook. He had a son. They're both eminent Talmudists. and they were the chief rabbis of Israel or Palestine for a
No,
period of
well,
time.
not the younger one. He wasn't the chief rabbi,
But the older
one
yeah,
was.
and he founded a big yeshiva there, the Rabbi
Yes,
Kook yeshiva.
yes, and Rabbi Kook was the intellectual, the source of fertility for the religious Zionist movement, and then by the time the Six-Day War came along, he was dead, and his son, the successor, Rabbi Kook, by that time was a very old man, but he had enough charisma left in him to take his father's teachings, which held that there was a way of reconciling Zionism and Judaism, an idea that was the antithesis of what Orthodox Jews believed. The son, Rabbi Kook, forged this into a dynamic and militant movement, and that's what we have seen ever since. These are the people who are leading the movement for the settlement movement on the West Bank, and they are standing in the way, it seems to me, of any kind of territorial compromise.
The Shas Party, do you talk about them in your book?
Oh yeah, at some considerable
Shas
length.
Party, for the listener, is the Orthodox Sephardic Party, which has garnered great strength, especially in the elections. I think they had 19 votes in the Knesset now, and they had a very famous man called Ayad Deri who went to jail for some kind of fraud or bribery or stealing. I'm not exactly sure what the final charges were. His trial went on for about 10, 12 years. But he was the leader, and he's been replaced by other people. There's a question as to whether he can come back, but I think he's banned by the law from coming back to active political...
for a limited period of time, I think 5 years in it.
But tell me, this has been a phenomenon in Israel, the Shas Party. When Ben-Gurion founded the state, there was no Shas Party, if I remember correctly.
No, there was no Shas Party, and there was no political organization among the Sephardim. You have to remember that the Sephardim came from the Arab world, where they had no familiarity with democracy. They were feeling very ill at ease. The dominant secular Zionists at the time made the terrible mistake of thinking that the only real settlers they were seeking to get were the sophisticated Jews from from Europe, and as a result, they tended to ignore the Sephardim. The Sephardim grew increasingly resentful. They are not militantly religious, but they are more pious than secular Jews, but they're not nearly as pious as the Orthodox, for example. But after a certain time, as you can understand, they began to organize. And they began to organize with the sole objective of building up a range of institutions that were Sephardi in nature, schools, schools, synagogues,
right.
Whatever. And they did a terrific job.
It worked very well.
It worked very well.
And they garnered a lot of political power.
And the problem was that, I mean, maybe we shouldn't say this is a Sephardi characteristic. It isn't, because fraud and embezzlement can happen anywhere. But their rabbinical leadership dragged out this interesting doctrine which said that any effort undertaken in behalf of God superseded the civil law. So that if Ayad Deri was a little bit of a crook in embezzling funds for these schools, it wasn't so bad, because the noble motive of the schools was in itself sufficient justification for his doing what he did. Well, this was an idea that spread throughout the religious community, unfortunately. The idea that somehow doing God's will, you didn't have to pay any attention to civil law. Well, in my judgment, this seriously undermined not only the legal system in Israel, but Israeli democracy itself. And I think it set the atmosphere in which, not very long thereafter, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, because there was a certain contempt for civil law and for civil order at that point.
Do you think it's possible to, A, have a constitution in Israel, and B, whether you can split the country into a pluralistic society with a Jewish culture or a Jewish... There are people trying to do this today. What's your thoughts on that?
When you say pluralistic, do you mean pluralistic among Jews or pluralistic among Jews and Arabs? We want to set up a Jewish state. I happen to sympathize with that objective. I don't think a Jewish state is the same as a theocracy, a state which is run by halakha, by Jewish law. I think a Jewish state can be a state which provides what it has done so well, very well, provide refuge for Jews around the world that are in jeopardy, whose lives are, or whose existence is in danger. That's the role that Israel was defined by the Zionist movement to play, when suddenly, in the eyes of religious Zionists, Israel became an expression of religious fervor. Then we got into trouble. It ceased to have a practical application. It acquired a divine purpose, and that's subsequently what made it so impossible, not only for Jews to live with Arabs in the kind of pluralistic society that you're suggesting, but for Jews to live with each other. I mean, that's the problem that Jews have in Israel, have been increasingly at each other's throats because they have been unwilling to tolerate alternate forms of worship. And that's dangerous.
Well, historically, from time immemorial, hasn't that been a Jewish problem?
Well, not time.
Were we originally tribes?
Yeah, we were originally tribes. But from the time of the fall of the Second Temple until the middle of the 18th century, there was only a unified Judaism. It was rabbinic Judaism. It was run under the leadership of rabbis, guided by the Talmud and Jewish religious law. This began to break apart in the 17th century only when, for a lot of external reasons, there was this huge population explosion in the Jewish world. From 1600 to about 1800, the number of Jews in Europe increased from a million to about 11 million. And the rabbis couldn't contain this. So for the first time in history, Jews were moving out of the ghettos and were moving into the general society.
So they lost control of society.
They lost the control of the society, exactly. The Jews were working with Gentiles and were living next to Gentiles. Assimilating, going to Gentile schools. This upset the rabbis very much, but they couldn't deal with it because there were so many of them at this point, and it created a crisis within Judaism that exists to this day.
We got a cut for a break, and we'll come back with a very interesting man, Milton Viorst, and his book is What Shall I Do with These People? Moses crying to God to find out what to do. It's still a cry, believe me. And I'm going to ask him what he thinks the future looks like in Israel, because if his thesis is correct, I don't know how you build these people together. The answer may be great leadership, but we'll ask Milton. We'll be right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie. Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels is now available in bookstores and online in paperback and an ebook for both Kindle and Nook. It's a great way to learn how history was made behind the scenes. Get it at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Be a witness to history. Order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon.com or buy it at Barnes & Noble and get the real story behind the making of the 1978 Camp David Accords.
We're back. I'm here with Milton Viorst, and the book is What Shall I Do with This People? And it's a story about Jews and the fractious politics of Judaism, which is really a very important topic in today's world. I think George Bush ought to read this book and, maybe take some positions which may help. Anyway, I asked you to consider during the time out, what do you think the future of Israel looks like?
Well, you raised the question of leadership, and it is true that the secular segment of the society has had really lousy leadership for at least since Rabin's death. Maybe you could say before that. It does not have a cadre of promising leaders even now. And I don't know why. One of the phenomenon that's worldwide is that religion is rising. Secular society is in retreat. And we're talking about the Christian world and the Muslim world as well as Judaism. We are going through the same phenomenon. I think at a certain point, we Jews are going to have to recognize that we are not going to have a viable state based upon military power, which I think is Ariel Sharon's vision It might work for a few years. It's not going to work indefinitely. I think we're going to have to reach some political agreement with the Jews, the neighbors of Israel's neighbors. It's going to mean, I don't even use the word sacrifice of land. At the moment, there's plenty of land for Jews to live comfortably on. But if you take the position that God is commanding us to hold this land, and there are people, you know, because if you look in the Bible, you're going to find references which say we have to go far beyond the Jordan River. That's what God envisaged, at least in one verse, which is the favorite of some of the Jewish visionaries, the ultra-right Jewish visionaries. But I think we have to tailor our vision of the Jewish state to one that can live in peace in the region. And I believe it can live in peace with the region. People ask me all the time, do you really believe the Arabs will live in peace with us? Well, the fact is, I think 50 years ago, they weren't ready to do that. But I think now they know that history has progressed too far for it to reverse itself, and there has to be some reconciliation with Israel. Prince Abdullah has a plan which he took to the Arab summit in Beirut. Last spring, you remember, all the Arabs endorsed it, which held that if Israel was able to make peace with the Palestinians, the entire Arab world, all of the Arab nations would endorse it. I think the prospect is there, and we are deceiving ourselves very seriously by saying the Arabs will never live with us. I think the Arabs will live with us, maybe reluctly, but they will live with us.
That's a $64,000 question out in the Middle East, and you'll hear it on both sides. The Likud people will tell you no, they can't, and the Labor Party people will tell you they can. The country is basically split down the middle, and no one seems to be able to unify it. Do you think Ben-Gurion, were he alive today, you think he could run this country, or it'd be nearly impossible?
No, I think it would be pretty much of a challenge even for Ben-Gurion at this point, because Ben-Gurion would pound his fist and show a kind of leadership that has been remarkably absent among, certainly on the secular side of the society, but even for him it would be difficult. But you know, I get suspicious of the people who tell me that the Arabs won't live with us, because it's never been tried, if you like. From 1993, the time of the Oslo Agreement, until Sharon made his famous walk on the Temple Mount, there was no appreciable amount of terrorism. There may have been a few small incidents, but there were more incidents that were provoked by religious Zionist settlers in the occupied territories than there were by Arabs, because during that period, I think most Palestinians had hope for a strong state of their own. I think if you look at the polls, you will find in 1993, the religious extremists, the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad people, had 4 or 5% of support among the Palestinians. Well, it's up to 40 or 50% now, because of the horrible things that have transpired in recent years. I think that most, not all, but I think that most Arabs would be quite happy to live at peace with an Israel which reduced its designs to the territory in which it lived before the 1967 war.
I have two questions. You obviously have interviewed some religious Zionists.
Quite a lot of them, yeah.
When you ask them, what do they see as the future for Israel? What is their answer?
Well, they don't really have an answer that makes much sense. They keep saying that they have to seek after the realization of this commandment that God has given them. They don't really entertain the possibility either that the Arab world will ultimately grow strong enough to genuinely threaten Israel, or are they bothered by the notion that the Arab birthright, our Arab birth rate, is so great that in as few as 20 or 30 years from now, there will be more Arabs west of the Jordan River, that is in Palestine, than there will be Jews. And what happens when that happens? What do we do then? Do we give up the Jewish state? Do we establish an apartheid state? Do we truck these people out of Israel? No, they have not come to grips with this. I hear over and over again, they say, God will take care of us. I guess I'm just secular enough to have a certain amount of skepticism about that as a political position.
Isn't it true, though, Milton, a lot of these settlers are not religious, but they've been there for economic reasons?
Oh, yeah. No, there are two groups of settlers. There are the religious Zionists who are moved by ideology, by zealotry, if you like. But the government has also pursued a policy since 1977, since Begin came in, of providing huge economic advantages to move out to the settlements. Lower taxes, subsidized mortgages, new road schools, benefits in water and other accommodations. So, yeah, many of them are out there for that reason, and people hypothesize, and I think with some justification, that these people would willingly move back to the other side of the Green Line if they were given some comparable economic incentive to move to the suburbs of Tel Aviv. And certainly that will have to be, in my judgment, part of the solution. But that still doesn't take account of what may be 25, 30, 40,000 religious Zionists out there who say, and I think a very large proportion of Israelis believe them, that they will fight and die in a civil war against Jews rather than evacuate the territory. And that presents a very troublesome dilemma.
I interviewed Avram Borg. Avram Borg is the Speaker of the Knesset, and he's the son of Joseph Borg, who was the longest sitting minister in the Israeli government, basically for the religious Zionists, for the Mavdal at that time, that party.
Right.
Avram Borg became a leader in the Labor Party and thought he was well on his way maybe to become prime minister. That's been short-circuited now. But I asked him these questions because he, in a sense, is a religious Zionist, but he had a much...
No, he's not a religious Zionist. He is a Zionist who happens to be religious. But religious Zionism means something else. Religious Zionism means you are a believer in Rabbi Kook. His view that God says the Messiah will only come after the Jews have established full control of the territories.
So you make a real differentiation there. So the modern Orthodox Jew who goes to Israel is basically, under your definition, not a religious Zionist unless he's a follower of Rabbi Kook's doctrine.
That's correct.
So there are many different shades of the religious grouping out in Israel.
Right.
Who would you consider a leader on the come in Israel? Would you see anybody on the horizon?
Well, I see some names and I read articles and I've even met many of these people. Avram Borg is somebody who was on the come and the gone,
right.
Unfortunately.
Right.
There is the mayor of Haifa, who was a former general, Avram Mitznah, who for a moment seemed to provide, and maybe still will.
I was there. It was a flash in the pan.
It really was.
And I'll tell you why. The defense minister of Israel is a Labor Party guy. You will never be able to dethrone the leader of the Labor Party if he's a defense minister. The power is too great there. I called that on this show about a year ago. I said there is no way you'll take... Now, I'm not sure he'll be a good leader for the party, and it doesn't look that way. And you have Chaim Ramon challenging him now, and you have...
Pines and a few others.
I don't think they can unite the country.
And Yossi Beilin. No, I mean, none of them seems to have the leadership capacity to unite
What's your opinion of Shimon Peres?
He has let us down at every crossroad. I think he's a decent and honorable man, for the most part. But when it came time to deliver, it wasn't there. And I think that's what most Israelis feel. He simply didn't have the spine, the integrity, call it what you want, to provide the kind of leadership to do unpopular things. And he did want to do unpopular things, important things. But Israelis mistrusted him. And unfortunately, his record is such that there was some considerable justification for this mistrust.
The consensus in Israel today is that if Arik Sharon moved out or retired or didn't even retire, that Bibi Netanyahu become the next prime minister. What do you envision as what would happen with the country under a Bibi Netanyahu reign?
Well, I think the difference between Bibi Netanyahu and Sharon is not in ideology, because they pretty much see the world the same way. I think Sharon is what you see is what you get. There is a certain old-fashioned honesty to Sharon, much as I dislike the direction in which this honesty takes him. I don't trust Netanyahu at all. He is a kind of a sneaky guy, and you can't. And I think that's why he lost the last election to Barak, that nobody felt that he was trustworthy. It was part of this same phenomenon as Peres. They really, he just didn't have the confidence of the country. But at the moment, there's a shortage of leadership even within the right wing, even within the Likud party. And I think that if Sharon retires, Netanyahu seems to be the only one who's standing there who could possibly succeed him.
And the Likud is the largest party in Israel today.
It will be at the time. Yeah.
It is. No,
yeah,
it is.
by the time of the next election, yeah, in terms of seats.
All right, George Bush. I want 2 questions, then I'll let you go. I know you're on a big tour. The Christian right have been very strong in supporting Israel. You see any danger in that?
Yeah, I see a lot of danger in that. I don't quite understand the reasoning for some short-term political benefit. What we are doing, what we Jews are doing, is making an alliance with a movement of Christianity that is profoundly anti-Semitic. I mean, you understand what the Christian right is. It holds that their interpretation of Christian doctrine holds that Jesus will only rise again for the second time after the Jews have established their control of all of biblical Palestine, after which there will be one of 2 things, depending upon which faction of the Christian evangelicals you believe in. One of them believes there will be a huge war, this Armageddon, which is so famous, and all the Jews will be wiped out. The other one holds that the Jews at that point will see the light and all convert to Christianity. So these aren't exactly friendly doctrines, at least for anybody who thinks well.
I've talked to Israeli leaders about it. Their answer is that that's a long way out.
Yeah, well,
and short term, we need all the friends we can get now. You know, the most effective lobby in Israel today is Tom DeLay and that whole grouping. They're stronger than AIPAC.
Well, I believe that, and I think it's absolutely true. And I think the mistake that Zionism, that Israel makes when establishing an alliance with the evangelicals, is to forget that there is an awful lot of liberal Christianity out there that has a great deal of sympathy for Israel. And if Israel identifies itself as a part of a right-wing Christian movement, we risk losing the friendship of an awful lot of Christians who are genuinely on Israel's side. And I don't think these evangelicals can be said to be on Israel's side.
All right, last question. George Bush, are you happy with the way he's treating Israel today?
You're kidding. No, I'm not happy
Sometimes I kid on this show. This wasn't a joke. No. Usually I do it with Jackie Mason.
Well, I'm not as funny as he is. I wish I were. But no, I think that George Bush is moving in exactly the wrong direction. He is encouraging our worst instincts. He too believes that all of the world's problems can best be solved by force, and I think he finds himself very much at ease with Prime Minister Sharon. I think he is moving exactly in the wrong direction, even in terms of our war on terrorism. But just leaving aside, but just dealing with Israel's well-being, I think that he is setting a trap for Israel and for the Jews. And I only hope we can escape from that before it's too late.
All right, Milton, thanks for coming on. Thanks for your optimism about everything. And we'll sure to repeat the program year to year. What shall I do with these people? It's
This People.
This People. This is Milton Viorst's book on the fractious politics of Judaism. And it's by the Free Press. I think he tells you the facts. I don't think he's a philosopher here. He's just telling you the facts. He studied the history, he's put the time in, and one must listen.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie. Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels is now available in bookstores and online in paperback and an e-book for both Kindle and Nook. It's a great way to learn how history was made behind the scenes. Get it at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Be a witness to history. Order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon.com or buy it at Barnes & Noble and get the real story behind the making of the 1978 Camp David Accords.
Today we have a very, very interesting man. His name is Rabbi Arthur Hertsberg. Probably has a PhD 5 times over, so we don't have to call him only a rabbi. He's written a very interesting book called Jew in America, My Life and People's Struggle for Identity. If we could figure this out on this show tonight, we will not only win Emmys, Academy Awards, and World Nobel Prizes. Jimmy Carter will take me along to Oslo, forfeit his own prize if we could figure out what Jewish identity is. So I'm struggling with this a long time, and I figured the best guy to talk to about this is Arthur Hertsberg. Arthur, welcome to our show. First time.
Delighted. Well, you know, we started this when you were about 18 years old and a student at yeshiva, and you came across the bridge to teach some kids for me.
Right.
In Englewood.
Right.
And we've been friends ever since.
Correct. But we've never done a TV show,
No,
so
let's do it.
we're on the air.
Right.
Why do Jews have so much struggle with their identity?
Well, it's really not a struggle. It's not a struggle that is historical and began at the beginning. At the beginning, it was very simple. Avraham Avinu, our ancestor Abraham, assumed that his identity was that he was the one believer in the one God. And if you had stopped any Jew, it's a question I used to ask on PhD orals when I was teaching at Columbia, when I was there for quite a long time. I asked the question of the candidate, if you had stopped a Jew in the year, let's say 1600, on any street in which Jews lived, anywhere in the world, and asked him, what makes you a Jew? He would have said, because I believe in the one true God.
So there is no identity crisis?
There was no identity crisis. The identity crisis begins somewhere in the middle of the 18th century and forward, when there are Jews who are Jews because they are anti-Semitism. There are Jews because they are national Jews and not religious Jews.
Zionists?
There are Zionist Jews who are either secular or not, or religious.
I'll tell you why it's an interesting. Somebody called me today,
Yes.
Mitzna, who's now the new head of the Labor
Yes,
Party.
I know him.
Who's a confirmed atheist.
Right.
Said to me and asked me a question, how could a confirmed atheist live in Israel? And I said, because he believes in the cultural identity of the Jewish people, he shares common experience, etc. I don't want to be rabbinical about it. But this is exactly the point, and this is why I think your book is going to be of great interest.
Well, in Mitzna's case, or in the case of Zionism, and I'm going to give something away to say that the way I stay alive is when I finish a book, I start another one. I've just started one, which Harper will publish quite rapidly, entitled The Case for Zionism. I think it's very necessary right now with Zionism very much under attack. Now, you may remember that my very first book was something called The Zionist Idea. And I dealt there with the question of what did Zionism come into the world to represent. And the answer is that Zionism was a nationalist revolt against the Jewish religion. The earliest kibbutzim were clearly not only non-religious, they were anti-religious.
The biggest celebrations were on Yom Kippur.
Right. And I remember my very first encounter with David Ben-Gurion. I was then a punk kid in about 20s. This was 49, the year after Israel's War of Independence had begun. It wasn't quite finished then. And after I heard him a while in his office, I said, Mr. Prime Minister, your Jewish position is there is no God, but he gave us the promised land.
Right.
And he chose us.
Right.
Now, we are Zionism and all of the other modern Jewish ideologies are in various ways parts of paradox. And you know, the best answer that I can give you at this moment was given by Freud.
Okay, let's talk to Freud.
Freud was asked to write an introduction to the first of his books to be published in Hebrew in translation in the 1920s, I think 27 or 28. And so he had to answer the question, in what sense are you a Jew? Having attacked religion, dethroned God, knowing that he had in his pocket a book which makes of Moses an Egyptian. What makes you a Jew?
Yeah.
And he said, I am a Jew. The mystery of it I haven't yet defined. Now, I answer it a bit differently. I quote my father. My father used to say, may I use 2 lines of Yiddish on this program?
We'll translate if we need.
Well,
we have a lot of.
We'll manage between us.
We have a big non-Jewish audience.
Yeah. Well, they should learn Yiddish.
They won't do it overnight.
No. My father used to say, the Jewish world doesn't consist of Orthodox, conservative, Reform, secular, religious. All of these are false distinctions. He said the really fundamental distinction is between Yidden v'sa'artze epis and Yidden v'sa'artze gornisht. In other words, Jews who are concerned specifically as Jews, whose Jewishness is an ideal, an irritant, the Magen David they bear, but they're never free of it. And Jews who have persuaded themselves that it is meaningless.
You have a fascinating background, if I recall. You went to a very Orthodox yeshiva?
No, I never spent a day of my life in a yeshiva.
Is that right?
My father, well, I went to a day school.
Day school.
I went to a very Orthodox day school.
Where were you born?
I was born in Eastern Galicia. I'm the only one of the...
It's near Trenton. Is that near Trenton?
Yeah. Eastern Galicia is near the Ukraine. It's on the southeastern end of Poland. And in fact, the town in which I was born, Lubachov, is the last town before you hit the Ukrainian border now. I was 5 when brought to this country, and I have some memories, chiefly of running away when the kids from the local school wanted to beat me up because I was going to Cheder. And then I grew up in Baltimore. Now, my father made up his mind.
There's a big yeshiva there, near Yisrael?
It was founded in my bedroom.
Sexy yeshiva.
Yeah, I was a kid of about 10 when Rabbi Ruderman came from Cleveland, from the yeshiva in Cleveland, the Telzer Yeshiva, and brought with him a few young men and said he wants to open a yeshiva in Baltimore. Now, Ruderman stayed with my parents, even though my father was the Hasidic Rav in Baltimore. I was exiled to a neighbor, and my father found him the space and the first money with which to start the yeshiva. He remained so close to the family that when my mother died and then my father, he gave the principal eulogy. And no.
Did you go to school too?
No.
You never went?
What happened to me was that my father made up his mind that I was going to be trained the way he had been trained in Galicia, by an individual
rabbi. Rabbi.
By an individual rabbi. My father used to wake me up straight through high school and college. In elementary school, I was in this day school in Baltimore, which was then called the Baltimore Hebrew Parochial School. It is now called a much more highfalutin name, the Talmudical Academy.
They all are.
Yeah, they've all gotten
They all got Talmudical academies.
Yeah. At any rate, my father, after I finished the 7th grade there, which was all there was, and went on to public school, said to me, I will wake you up at 5:30 in the morning, and we will study Talmud for 2 hours before you go to school. And so it was through junior high school, and college.
Where did you go to college?
Johns Hopkins. In addition to, well, it was the hometown school, in addition to which, every summer we studied 10 hours a day, every day, aside from Shabbat. At the end of, for my 18th birthday, I was examined by two of the senior rabbanim and rabbis in Baltimore, most Orthodox, East European kind, and they conferred upon me rabbinic ordination, Orthodox rabbinic ordination. And then came the problem of what was I going to do with myself. And it was, remember, you're just about old enough to know, Leon, that American academic life was terribly anti-Semitic before World War II. I applied to Harvard for a fellowship in Semitics. I got it. And William Foxwell Albright, the great Orientalist, who was my teacher at Johns Hopkins, called me in, closed the door, and said, "You have to eat from your further training. Your family is not rich." He said, "You must therefore do something which will produce a living." He said, "The only places where there are academic appointments for Jews right now are the Hebrew Union College, Reformed, or the Jewish Theological Seminary." And he said, "I know your family well enough to know that you can't go to the Hebrew Union College. What are you going to eat there?"
It's a reformed.
Yeah, and obviously, part of the reform was that they did not keep a kosher kitchen, a kosher kitchen. So he said, "You must go to Jewish Theological, and you'll probably stay on the faculty." So I went. And then what happened was that the war intervened. I arrived there in 40. By 41, the fall of 41, we were in the war. We were graduated in 43, and there was no thought of doing anything academic because the needs of the moment were much too large. I eventually wound up in the military chaplaincy. And so all my life, even as I've been a rabbi a good bit of the time, I've always had an academic appointment somewhere. I was 30 years adjunct professor of Jewish history at Columbia. So I've run kind of two things.
All right, you are an inspiration to a lot of people, and people look to you for some kind of answers to a lot of things. So let's hit some hot buttons that are going on today. First, let's talk about Israel, and I want to make a little comment. I had predicted that Bibi Netanyahu would go down very forcefully in the Likud election, and he did. And it could be, I'm not sure, and we'll talk to Arthur about that because he follows that as well as I do, that his career may be in jeopardy in the future in terms of him being a prime minister. Arik Sharon has really grabbed the harnesses now and reins, and he's in charge of that country as of now. Mitzna, whom Arthur knows and I know, the mayor of Haifa, is now the chosen leader of the Labor Party, and if I'm going to make a fearless forecast, I would say that there's a good possibility the end of the road with this election coming to pass in February, I believe, that Mitzna might join the Sharon. He might join the Sharon government. Arthur, give me your opinion about what I just said.
I think it's remarkable that we are, without having talked about this at all, in agreement. I think that, let me just be a little more pointed. I think that Israel has taken the measure of Netanyahu and decided he's not heavy enough. In his own way, and I'm not comparing the two, but I had to write, and it's probably in the current issue of the Jerusalem Report, they phoned me 10 days ago to write a piece about Aubrey Eban. Yeah,
we played a whole dedication to Aubrey last week, and I knew him fairly well. I'm sure you did.
I knew him very well. Now, I said in this piece, I'm saying in this piece, that the question is, why is it that with all his talents, Eban never became the Prime Minister of Israel, never attained his ultimate hope? And the answer that I gave was that Israel took his measure and came, all the other reasons I didn't think told the truth, that Israel took his measure and decided that he was its barrister and not its leader.
You're absolutely right. I knew him well. I was on a lawn of the Labor Party when they dismissed him, even through the Knesset. Shimon Peres is the man who did it. I'll never forget it. And I said it on the show a couple of weeks ago. Everybody was there dressed in khaki and the typical labor uniform. He was there in a suit and a bow tie.
That's right. And I say in this piece that he would have looked completely out of character wearing a kibbutz shirt.
You're right.
So there we are.
We've got to continue this at another conversation. It's fascinating. And Arthur is a great he gives great commentary on really, not only Judaic things, on humanities. You hear what he said about the Middle East. It's the pragmatic approach, which is the interweaving of financial and scholastic achievements on both sides. Because if you're going to follow the books literally, you have assassinations. Arthur, thank you for coming on. We're all going to read.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie. Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels is now available in bookstores and online in paperback and an e-book for both Kindle and Nook. It's a great way to learn how history was made behind the scenes. Get it at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Be a witness to history. Order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon.com or buy it at Barnes & Noble and get the real story behind the making of the 1978 Camp David Accords.